Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. I am Michael Brooks. I am he. Joining us now is Natalie. She is the host, the proprietor of ContraPoints, ContraPoints. A multidisciplinary, multimedia, short film, commentary, analysis, history, philosophy YouTube channel. Everybody should check out if you haven't already. It's brilliant. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back again.
It's my pleasure. I think that you are absolutely one of the best in the game right now. It's sort of getting to the heart of a lot of controversies and points of debate, which I think that there is a level of reaction and lack of articulation that a lot of people on our side, frankly, have. And then on the other hand, there is a resurgence of grotesque, demented, discredited, dangerous, and sickening ideas on the other side. So
yeah, that's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah, so you're
exactly.
You're fitting in a very, very important space and doing a lot of really important work.
Thank you. Yeah.
I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with a science writer and YouTube podcast host, Hunter Matz. We were debunking IQ myths. I want to go more broadly with you and talk about race and gender as just categories of how to, sort of describe and understand people. I think, gender maybe in some ways might be a bit more complicated. So let's start first with race and just explain, or maybe not more complicated. Maybe that's just my own bias, but let's just start with race and explain, what is a modern guide to race as a category? Where did this actually come from? Did this just sort of naturally emerge from, the great biologists of Christian era Europe? Or, where does this come from?
So first, I agree that scientifically, race is much simpler in a lot of ways than gender, although I think sociologically it's at least as complicated.
Right.
I guess, the concept of race, I mean, it's not eternal. It's not universal. It wasn't really found in ancient Greece, for example. It's not discussed ever by Aristotle, who talks a lot about biology. So it's a concept
and slaves as well. So when they were talking about slaves, they're not Could you explain that briefly?
Yeah, so ancient Greek slavery was not based on race. So there was this idea that it's in Aristotle, actually, that there are this class of people called natural slaves who are born from the same, they didn't think about genetics, but they were also Greeks. But the ideological position was that the people who are slaves are just naturally like that. They're just subservient by nature. But it wasn't, a race thing. But it's interesting to see the same kinds of justification suddenly show up relating to race in the 17th and 18th centuries, coincidentally, actually not really, but at exactly the same time as European slave trade was really getting huge. And that's when you first see science or naturalists, European naturalists, talking about the concept of race, is when you have widespread colonialism and slavery.
Right. So that basically, and I just think this is so important. I keep wanting to kind of index this point because I think what's happening right now, as I say, is that there is a version of very, very important historically grounded arguments that explain things like how does racism get naturalized, or the problems of how you actually scientifically deconstruct gender. These are things that if you study them, agree, disagree, there's a lot of areas of debate and conflict and everything like any other area of inquiry. But there is a very sophisticated, very historically dense literature. And somehow in the popular representation of these ideas, it's amounted to these very, very trivial representations of them. And then on the other side, there's this kind of endless assertion that no, these categories are really, really real and they're really, really fixed. And if you don't accept them, you're in some kind of PC fantasy zone. And just continuing in on race. So we know that there is a Greek definition of a servile group of people. They're just born that way. That idea gets transferred onto race, specifically correlating with the rise of the slave trade And then maybe you can move us forward, even up into the advent of kind of like the sort of modern racism that you would see in all of its varieties, focusing on things like IQ and all the rest.
Yeah, so the 18th and 19th century sort of racist pseudoscience really, I mean, it got picked up basically by the National Socialism in Germany, and used to justify those policies. And as well, at the same time, it was being used in the United States to justify programs of eugenics.
Right.
And there was this period after the Second World War where there was this kind of widespread consensus politically, well, I mean, not an entire consensus, but a greater consensus than there is today, politically and sort of more broadly culturally, that, oh gosh, this stuff is really dangerous pseudoscience. It leads to people being killed. It leads to genocide. Like, we've got to get rid of it. But that memory seems to have faded a little bit. So this old nonsense is back in public discourse again. And it's basically the same kind of thing. And you're right that it's very difficult to talk to a popular audience on this subject because you're fighting an uphill battle against this widespread ideology that the supposedly apolitical view of race and gender is that it's these fixed categories that sort of determine a certain social order. And if you question that, it's seen as this like political PC kind of move.
So who were the European guys specifically that came up with these different categories that we talk about now when we talk about race?
So there's a lot of different race scientists from the 18th. It's first introduced in the 17th century, but one of the big figures of the 19th century was a French aristocrat named Arthur de Gobineau.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a book called, I think it's called Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, in which he comes up with this idea of the Aryan master race, which is obviously the idea that was picked up by National Socialists later. And this is also, I recently just discussed this in a video. He's also the same figure, Gobineau, introduces a sort of contemporary fascist idea of degeneracy, or the idea that there can be a race can degenerate. In particular, there's this anxiety about the white race or the Aryan master race, becoming weakened or becoming hollow, becoming degenerated by, well, either miscegenation or by some kind of, I don't know, deviant sexual or artistic activity.
Right.
And I mean, of course, we all know about, decadent art and the Nazi era, but the stuff is just back into internet politics and this weird turn of events where like 1930s far right ideology is just being spread on image boards as if it was like, not as if it was part of contemporary politics, which I'm afraid that it's sort of becoming.
I think it is.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos